Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Navigating Now, actually episode 179 to be exact. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the concept of leadership alpha. But before we get there, just a quick introduction to me. My name's Grift. I lead our customer-facing team here at Thaudium, and I am very, very privileged and honored to be bringing this guest to our space, to our table here today. By a man by the name Dan Cremons. And today, Dan and I are going to be talking about the concept, as I mentioned, leadership alpha, delivering outsized results through developing talent. And Dan, in working at his firm, Accelera Partners, a firm that helps ambitious PE firms accelerate people-powered value creation, we are going to discuss the power of investing in this concept of leadership alpha as it pertains to investor-backed organizations. So without further ado, if I could welcome Dan into our space here. Dan, how's it going?
Hey, Grift. How are you, man?
I'm doing fantastic. It's a beautiful day here, although it's a little rainy here in Cincinnati, but we're keeping on. We're feeling pretty good.
Did I do this right in pretending like you and I hadn't seen each other prior to the last 15 seconds?
A little bit more energy and enthusiasm about an old friend seeing someone for the first time.
Oh, good to see you.
There we go. That's
been a while. All of about 90 seconds since I saw you last.
Absolutely. Well, Dan, I imagine this energy and enthusiasm is going to be carried throughout our conversation, but really, really happy to have you here. And frankly, having a conversation that I don't know if it's overdue, but at least really well timed. We talk about this concept of leadership alpha and what that means. And we're going to get into a lot of this together. But before we unpack maybe the concept of the topic at hand, why don't we do a little unpack of Dan Cremons as he comes to the Navigating Now table for the first time. So Dan, tell us a little bit about you. Let's maybe start with the end in mind. What do you do today? And then maybe we can back up into how you got there. So how would you describe, in a nutshell, what you do?
Yeah, in short, I help investors, which I'll use that language broadly, but that includes private equity firms, venture capital firms, and growth equity firms. I help investors to accelerate this thing that I call people-powered performance in their portfolio companies. So that's sort of generic, but a lot of the work I do today, all of the work I do today in some way, shape, or form is aimed at helping investor-backed companies to unlock more of the human potential that resides within them and then better translate that human potential into actual business performance. So I do this through, a number of different productized services. I do quite a bit of pre-closing, pre-investment due diligence, focused primarily on leadership, talent within these these investor-backed companies. Do a lot of work with boards and leadership teams to help them all get aligned on how they're going to create value and how they're going to unlock people-powered performance in their companies. And something I've been doing a lot more of in the past year or two is leadership development within investor-backed companies. Okay. I know we're going to talk quite a bit about today.
Yeah, super exciting. And I just have to say, I love the people-powered performance, not only because it's very alliterative, very memorable, and, but very believable and very easy to get behind when you think about, just the simple concept there. Yeah. So so I asked you what you did, but now importantly, a little bit, maybe just a short story, if you will, Dan, of how you ended up here versus anywhere else. So tell us a little bit about the backstory that got you into in this realm, starting your own firm, people power performance. What brought you here?
Yeah, to make a long story short, I've spent the last 15 or so years working in the private equity space. And I've done this I've been an investor in businesses. I've been an operator, CEO, and a CXO within different investor-backed companies. I'm now advising private equity-backed companies. So I've seen this world of investor-backed businesses, private equity-backed businesses from a bunch of different vantage points as operator, as investor, as board member. And there's a lot we could talk about within that in terms of things I've learned. But I think the one really salient point that's going to shape this whole conversation is the reason that I've dedicated this chapter of my career to this idea of helping investors unlock people-powered performance is the simple realization, and I've had a lot of experiences that we can talk about that have shaped this, but the realization that in today's knowledge economy, it is people, it's human potential that makes these businesses tick and allows them to produce results. And leaders, it turns out, are the key to bringing out the best in those people and then translating that human potential into actual business performance. So this seems sort of commonsensical, but it took some really important aha moments through the arc of my career to really make me realize and internalize this. I'll give you one quick, short story that I think really shaped quite a bit of this worldview for me. So I started my career in finance. I was trained to look at businesses through the numbers in the spreadsheets. I know you're a recovering finance nerd like me, so we can geek out on that later. But I remember I think the year was 2010 or so, I was working at a private equity group at the time that was investing in small, mid-sized companies. And I think it was 2010. I had my first real leadership experience within an operating business. This was a company that had fallen on hard times. It was sort of a turnaround situation. And this was my chance to dive into an operating business and take a leadership role. And going in, I knew the numbers of this business cold. I was sitting in the private equity ivory tower with my nose in the financials and their operating dashboards. I knew the numbers of the business cold. But when I landed on the shop floor in this business, I realized something that may seem sort of obvious to say it out loud, but was a new thing for me at the time, which is that in order to hit the numbers, in order to make the numbers that appeared on the spreadsheet happen and make those numbers pretty, we actually had to get people to do things, things that were uncomfortable, things that were new, things that required change in behavior and attitude and mindset and skill set. Mm-hmm. And this business really struggled from a lack of leadership. And I saw from the inside how much that held this business back. And so the moral of the story is this helped me to learn one of the most important learnings I've had in my career, which is that if the financials are the output, which we as investor types can easily fixate on, human capability is the most important input that will determine that output. So if you are into generating great business performance, as most investors or operators or business leaders are, focus on the people first. This became the core of our strategy at my last firm and really the cornerstone of a lot of my leadership worldview of get the people part right first, put leaders in a position to bring out the best in those people, and inevitably the numbers will happen.
Yeah, it's really cool just maybe to hear, the unpacking of people power performance and how it happened to you over that experience. And sometimes all it takes is for us to have an extremely visceral moment like that, and the path becomes so clear, so illuminated. Yeah. So how cool to hear how that shifted. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me flip it back to you for a second. I know that you and I have traveled similar paths in the sense that you started in finance and now have taken about as hard left of a turn as one can in their career into the world of leadership development. How did that shift happen for you?
I knew at some point you were going to turn this into you being the podcast host, and that's totally fine. It's interesting. I would say a similar moment for me, maybe not so much in the same industry, but I found myself feeling a little, let's call it detached. Like when I would know businesses, it felt like I knew like their operating bones and the structure, and I understood their go-to-market model, and I could start to then make recommendations on how things could be shifted or synergized or whatever that might look like. I called back to when I was in school. When I was in college, one of the things I loved to do was organize people to do new things. And I never thought that I would find a career that got me more close in proximity to that. But when I think about what I do today, to boil it down, in the best of my days, the best work I get to do is bring people into environments to try and do new things, whether it's new skills, whether it's, new beliefs, whether it's new working styles. It's something that it feels like a privilege for me to be able to have people and be alongside people who are trying to do those new things and stretch themselves and build careers. Again, to your point, all in the lens of driving results. Which I don't want to lose sight of. Like, this is not just hey, let's all just get better for better's sake. We definitely want to get better, but when we get better, our companies tend to get better and results tend to get better in kind as well. So found my way that way.
I love that. You and I share a passion for mobilizing people to do big things. I mean, that's a big part of my passion as well. You're making me think of a little soundbite that a mentor of mine many years ago shared that it sort of whizzed by me at the time, but later on, I was like, oh, I now understand what he's saying. His quote was, and this guy, just for context, was an older, a former CEO, business leader who, it was many years retired and was just doing consulting work, sort of an old gray-haired sage, quite literally gray-haired sage. And he had this quote, which was, businesses are nothing more than people working with other people to do stuff for people. At the time I heard that, I was like, okay, yeah, next question. Some years down the line, it hit me like there's so much beauty and importance to the essence of that phrase, in a sense that if you strip a business down to its fundamental building blocks, it's just a bunch of people together that are doing stuff together for more people. And I think that is a sort of circling back to my earlier point of why I've moved in the direction of my career that I have. But it's really that realization that if you can get the individual building blocks, the people playing as a high performing team, in service to a big, mission and vision and desired outcome, that seems to be as good of a formula or recipe for business success as any, is get those individual building blocks humming.
That's so well said. And I think, a really nice segue actually for us into, maybe let's call it the topic du jour, which is this concept of leadership alpha. So before we get into leadership alpha and what we mean by that, maybe we can take a couple steps back. Maybe some folks on the line who are listening in aren't as familiar with maybe just the general concept of alpha. But Dan, in the context of investor-backed world or companies, what is alpha? What are we looking for when we talk about alpha in the lens of returns?
Yeah, I'll first just frame how I think about this idea of investor-backed companies. We'll use this language and probably use some of the components of that language throughout this. So I think of investor-backed companies generically as including early-stage venture-backed businesses. And these will sort of follow the sequence of just a business's overall maturity, but early-stage venture-backed businesses. The next stage of maturity tends to be what they call in the business growth equity, which is, hey, you have product market fit, you're past the early startup phase, you have some revenue. It's now about taking on some money so you can grow faster. And then there's the next step on the continuum is private equity. These are investors that invest in more established, in most cases, profitable businesses. So we're going to clump all those together and just call them investor-backed businesses. Know coming into this that the primary lens I bring to this topic is from the vantage point of somebody who's invested in private equity, more mature private equity-backed businesses. But to your question, the concept of alpha is really the same across all of those stages on the graph. For those who aren't reformed finance weenies like me, alpha is the excess return that a fund or a company is able to generate above and beyond the rate of return generated by the benchmark or their peers. So in layperson's terms, it's basically a company or a fund's ability to outperform. And generating alpha or outperformance is of course important for investor-backed companies, because if they don't outperform their peer set, it's going to be tougher to raise money. For companies, it's going to be tougher to meet your investors' target returns and their expectations. So in the private equity world, in the venture world, in the growth equity world, the firms that grow and succeed are those that can consistently generate alpha or outperformance relative to their peers and benchmarks, and having companies in their portfolios that outperform in such a way that drives that alpha.
Yeah. So Dan, maybe to play that back, just so, maybe I'll put it in even simpler terms. It's the alpha is that justification over time of why I, as an investor, would put money into a company that would get me more money there back than if I were just to invest it in either a peer company or in the similar industry benchmark.
Well said. Well said.
Okay.
Yeah.
So alpha is what we're after in the world of investor-backed companies. What would you consider to be the generally held belief, or maybe the belief over time, of what typically generates alpha?
I'll give you a bit of just a quick history lesson. This has evolved over time, and where we are today is considerably, in terms of what drives alpha, is considerably different than when I joined private equity 15 years ago. When I started in PE 15 years ago, there were some sort of tried and true ways to make money or generate alpha in PE-backed businesses, where investors tended to make their returns back then in the early days of private equity were, we're going to put debt on, we're going to buy a company. We can buy it a lot more cheaply 15 years ago than we can today because there was just less competition for these businesses. So we're going to buy it. We're going to buy it at a discount. We're going to put some debt on it. And if anybody has a mortgage, you probably understand the concept of what debt can do to equity returns. The more debt you have, the more it tends to enhance equity returns. So we're going to make our money that way through having debt. And then we're going to optimize these businesses, which is sometimes just a fancy word for we're going to cut costs. We're going to make them run better, run more efficiently. That was the old way of generating alpha. Over the 15 years I've been in the space, the world has changed quite a bit. More and more investors have come onto the scene over 15 years, running those same exact plays. And because everybody is now running those plays, it's meant it's tougher and tougher to outperform those firms if you're all running the same playbook. Just for context, there are like 6,000 to 12,000 private equity firms in existence today, depending on how you define that market. So it's gotten a heck of a lot more competitive. Those tried and true ways of generating alpha no longer are going to win the day and allow you to outperform. The market's just way too competitive and way too efficient nowadays. So the punchline is, and this brings us up to present day, firms are having to find new ways to outperform. They're having to find a new edge. And we're living in what I call, at least in private equity speak, the value creation era of private equity, where firms are having to rely a lot more on actually making these businesses better, growing them faster after they own them in order to generate alpha. So in the past 5 or so years, this emphasis on building businesses has caused firms to put a much greater emphasis on human capital as an enabler of that. And further within that, the focus up until now has really been on improving the discipline around how do we hire great leaders into these businesses. So you see more firms hiring heads of talent and building out talent acquisition teams. But, and this will sort of, dovetail, I think, into the real topic du jour here. I'm calling my shot a little bit here to say, I think my prediction is that the next frontier of how firms can gain a human capital advantage and generate alpha, therefore, is a focus on developing leaders.
And that brings us to leadership alpha.
That's right.
Yeah.
Why is this? Because, going out and trying to recruit the same high-performing leaders that every other firm in the super competitive market is trying to recruit is not a differentiated move. And if it's not a differentiated move, then it's unlikely to gain you an edge that will generate alpha. You just don't have control over your supply of leadership talent. But developing leaders from within is a way to own what is perhaps the biggest advantage and asset a firm can possess, which is having an abundant and controllable supply of great leadership talent. So that's why I think we're heading into a new frontier where firms are going to start paying a lot more attention to how do we not only generate leadership alpha broadly as a core of our investment strategy, but within that, how do we take a more proactive role in developing great leaders from within to power people power performance? Yeah,
it's and I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that, Dan, of where we are in that maybe curve or trend, because we tend to we talk about these things almost like the old innovation curve, right? Like we're gonna have like the early adopters maybe lead the way. As you think about maybe those early adopters, people or firms or funds you're talking to who are maybe have passed the belief gap and they're in it, like what are some of the characteristics you're seeing in those firms that are maybe common or unique in that group compared to others?
I think it's a fundamental, it's two things. A fundamental belief that you can't bring out the best in your portfolio companies unless you bring out the best in their leaders. That's thing number one, which is a mindset and belief thing. I don't want to sit here and try to convince somebody that leadership is important to investment returns. And most private equity firms understand that. But that's thing number one, is you have to believe that first and foremost. The second impediment or roadblock that a lot of firms face is going from an intellectual understanding that that's true, that leadership actually matters to investment performance, to knowing how do we operationalize that belief in our business in a way that gains us an edge when it comes to attracting talent, assessing talent, onboarding talent, and developing and retaining talent. And so, just to, punchline that, it's baseball season now, so I'm going to use a cheap baseball metaphor. I think we're probably, in terms of private equity's investment in developing leaders, I'm going to paint in broad strokes here. We're probably in like the top of the second inning, bottom of the second inning. There are some firms, and I can speak to some bright spots and case studies. My last firm was I'm proud to say, was one of the real innovators and leaders in the early days of this movement, and learned a lot about the power of a people-led, leadership-focused strategy. But my just experience in the private equity market, knowing a bunch of firms, has told me that very few firms are programmatic today about how do we raise up great leadership talent from within our portfolio.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing you share too is there's a fundamental belief, and it's been there for a while, of talent acquisition being so important, getting the right people in the right seats. But these newer folks or these early adopters are finding the introduction or the investment in the talent life cycle and what that can do in terms of exponential value creation compared to their peers.
Totally. And it's an and. Yeah. A big part of my core business, I run an advisory business called Accelera Partners. My core business is really in, a big part of my core business is really in assessing leaders, pre-acquisition, post-acquisition for key CEO and CXO hires. And so make no mistake, the idea of how do we attract great talent, how do we identify and assess great talent and win great talent, clearly an important part of the game. I guess what we're saying is there's this new thing that's coming into the fore that is, okay, once we've done that, how do we develop great leadership talent from within, recognizing that in these businesses that investors are acquiring or backing, there's all sorts of incumbent leadership talent that has a lot of potential that's yet to be unlocked. So instead of just swapping them out, which has its own set of consequences and risk, instead of just swapping them out, what would it look like if we not only brought great leadership talent into the business, but also, invested in and developed the leaders from within?
Yeah. And it seems to me like maybe changing the view or the lens on it being a point in time, we have to get this particular hire or this particular position right. And instead seeing it again as this is all part of this cycle. So we still have to be great here, but then we have to invest in these folks. We have to develop these folks. We have to give them the tools and maybe sometimes even the oxygen, metaphorically, to recover or reset and going through, the challenging waters that is, running an investor-backed organization, which comes with all sorts of challenges, but opportunities as well. Kind of related to that, Dan, I'm curious, maybe some folks are in, who are also reformed financial weenies like us, or maybe folks who are still in the financial space are listening in, and maybe they're what's the proof in the pudding, so to speak. So as we think about this, and I think it's great to say, hey, we can help talent perform better. We can help leaders perform better and drive teams. But what are some metrics that we could start to point to or really highlight that might illuminate this path and again, get more folks into that early adopter portion of the innovation curve?
Couple things come to mind. First is, I'll just sort of parrot back what the private equity market has told us relative to this question. There's 95%, and this came from some research of private equity leaders. 95% of private equity leaders polled view leadership as being very, quote unquote, very important. It's sort of a headline assertion, but there's clearly an understanding that this topic is important. So I think that's good for starters. Furthermore, that same group of respondents believe that over 50% of investment returns can be attributed back to the quality of leadership. And so these are not sort of, measurable KPI based things. But I think at a headline level, that reinforces the point that investors recognize this is important and have gone as far as to convince themselves that great leadership is actually pretty deterministic of investment outcomes. So that's a data point. Another data point is, I'll just go back to, maybe I'll share a quick story or anecdote that is rich in data from my last firm. I worked for a firm called Alpine Investors on the West Coast for a number of years. This is the firm I mentioned. We did a lot of really innovative things in the way of human capital-led strategies. We called it people first, was the whole core strategy of the firm. And there was plenty of case studies which are backed by cold hard data that support that when taking an intentional approach to aligning great leaders with high potential businesses, the results tend to support the merit of doing that. But I will say that we in like 2012 or so came to this realization as a firm that we were doing some of the attribution analysis in terms of what generates investment returns where we've had them, what has held back investment returns where we've struggled. One of the things that we realized was one of the highest correlated factors with our investment success is generally the quality of leadership in those companies. Furthermore, the degree to which we've actually been intentional, thoughtful, and decisive about putting high quality leadership into place in these businesses. So that was a light bulb moment for us as a firm that said, okay, the performance data is showing us that if we become more intentional and deliberate and disciplined about getting the leadership part right, and history is any indicator, that should be a great catalyst for investment returns. So we went all in on this this strategy and the series of programs, one of which was called the CEO in Training program. It's highly relevant to this conversation. We viewed long-term, we thought that having control over the supply of great CEO talent, developing that and building that from within was a much better strategy than having to go out to market every time we needed to hire a CEO and compete with every other firm for great CEOs. So we said, okay, let's build a program that allows us to incubate and grow and groom great CEO talent from within. And here's where we're going to circle back to your actual question of where's the proof in the pudding. If we just look at the performance of portfolio companies that have been led by leaders who have passed through this CEO in Training program, which is rich in mentorship and leadership development, the performance of these companies has been insane. And that's not a legal term. Insane is not a legal term. But
let's maybe outsized alpha. How about that?
Outsized alpha, and have been very convincing when it comes to just the fundamental premise of this whole conversation, which is when you take high potential leaders, you invest in them, and then you put them into high potential businesses, good things tend to happen. Results tend to happen. Alpha tends to happen. So this is, I'm not giving you a single threaded answer other than to say, I have a lot of just case studies and return data from that experience that has told me that there's a real there. And I'm hearing there's a lot of, maybe A/B testing out there that we actually probably could pull from. And at the same time, that's a little bit of just the nature of maybe the difficulty of our space. If I talk about our space, maybe being more in the leadership development realm, it's very hard sometimes to talk about the power or the impact of leadership development because it has so many impacts everywhere. And you can't necessarily say it is the reason for anything, but you can very rarely discount it to say it had no impact. And I think that's what's really interesting and fascinating about this whole hypothesis we're creating. Well, and think about this in leading and lagging indicators, if you want to be, kind of jargony about it. What I just gave you were the lagging indicators, the results indicators. And I'm going on the record and saying we've got results data that would suggest that when you develop leaders, alpha tends to happen, period. But to your point, that's sort of a bit far down the field, and it's tough to make the connection between leadership development as an activity and that for a lot of companies. So if you go one step upstream to the quote unquote leading indicators, I think we just have to rely on some common sense to say, for those who have been in these businesses, if you can get the leaders in your businesses playing at a 10%, 15%, 20% higher level, what would that look like? Probably is going to mean they're able to get more out of their team. So what sort of leading indicators does that flow through to? Up productivity, team efficiency, team motivation. Probably means that they're going to be better equipped to retain great talent. And we can talk about the cost of employee churn and the benefit of employee retention. When we start to break it down that way in a really pragmatic, practical way, it doesn't, it's not a stretch to understand how improving leadership effectiveness, even by a small amount, can have an immediate and significant here and now impact on the operating performance of the business. Never mind the one-day exit returns that a private equity firm will get, but the here and now performance in that business.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we talk about this a lot in terms of employee lifetime value being one of the main drivers of your customer lifetime value, and I think maybe this is a good frame of that. And I think, Dan, what you and I have chatted about at length at times is getting people maybe over that belief hump is a very, very hard thing to do. And it's probably not something that you and I just can do on our own. I think maybe even going back to your personal anecdote, like generally to get over that, there has to be some kind of experience you've had, very visceral experience that shows you the cost of not having this investment, or that shows you what bad leadership can do from the inside and rot the company from the inside out. Let's say, but maybe we're focused more on that group of individuals who do believe and do know that this matters, but they have all that appetite and not so much of the metaphorical metabolism. Where might they start? What might be some first things you could share with folks to say, if you're moving in this direction, you're kind of starting down the right path?
I think step number one in all of this, leadership development broadly, is developing a point of view within your company, or if you're a financial, investor person within your portfolio companies, developing a point of view on what leadership skills and abilities are actually needed to succeed, are most important to success in the companies we are running or investing in. That's where this all starts. I studied this at Alpine for years as we were, getting better at human capital assessment and standing up these training programs. So I've developed my own point of view on this, part research-based, part experience-based. And furthermore, in developing this program that we've been partnering on, we talk to a lot of other investors and ask them this question: what skills and attributes are most important in your experience to leadership success in your companies? And, we heard a lot of the same themes: hiring and team building, financial management, data-driven decision-making, setting and driving a value creation plan, which is a private equity word. It's basically setting and driving a strategy for the business, managing to numbers. These are all skills that firms are saying are very important. So I think that's where this all starts, is like when you talk about developing people, developing relative to what? So I think that's step one. Step two is developing a point of view, again, within your company or portfolio companies on, well, how well do each of our leaders stack up against that today? There are ways to assess this. This is part of the work I do with private equity firms. There are ways to assess this. The reality is, for many venture-backed and small private equity-backed companies, leaders have just never had training on these things. So it's kind of unreasonable to expect that a leader is going to be able to build a value creation plan, financially manage a business to the extent that a private equity firm is expecting, if they've never been trained on how to do this. So I think that's step two, is just figuring out, like, where are we today? And then step three, to state the obvious, is how do we close those gaps between where we are today and the point of view from my little step one, the point of view on what skills are actually most important to be building. And that's where leadership development programmatically comes into play. I mean, there's a lot we could talk about on how do you do that right. But I think that's where it has to start. Yeah,
I love that. Simply what I heard you share: define, assess, and then plan and execute. Sounds a little bit like building a strategy, right? What's really interesting about that too, maybe just to share from our world, a lot of the conversations we have with organizations who, and maybe you can relate to this idea of learn by doing, get expertise by doing. The retort we might have to that, though, is it takes doing it right to learn the right way of doing. And if you're learning by doing, if you're not doing it the right way, you might be learning the behavior or skill that we're actually not looking for. And therefore, like, what are you going to do to allow people to understand and maybe build some of those practice environments that allow them to know what I'm doing is actually the right thing, and here's how I'm building into it.
Hear, hear. Amen. That jives with my own personal experience.
Yeah.
As a once underdeveloped leader, the school of leadership I came up through was what you described, basically, which is just toss them in the deep end and hope they figure it out. And guess what? Like, over time, I think I generally figured it out. It was painful and it was awkward at times, but I think I generally figured out some of the core tenets of how do you lead effectively. I'm always going to be learning in this area, but I figured some of that out. But I also acquired some bad habits. And there's plenty of areas where I could have accelerated my own leadership development and therefore leadership effectiveness if, like, I had understood how to do some of these things the right way up front. And so while there is benefit, as you're saying, to getting in there and experiencing leadership firsthand and having to fumble your way through some things, sure does help to have a container where you can learn how to do some of these things the right way and practice and try before you're in a super high stakes situation.
Yeah. And not to plug for you, Dan, but if anyone out there is in this situation, they might be looking at that person who can help them and address these gaps right in the face on this episode right now. So Dan, maybe in that lens, as we think about, leadership alpha, generating leadership alpha, delivering these outsized returns in this new world of value creation, outside of those first steps, are there other things you would like to share or maybe point people toward to get people, again, moving in the positive direction?
Yeah. I'll just maybe leave you with a question, and then depending on your answer to that question, when I say you're the audience with a question, depending on your answer, we might have something to offer. But if you are of the mindset that we described earlier, which is you can't bring out the best in your portfolio companies without bringing out the best in their leaders, or if you're leading within a business, you can't bring out the best in your company's performance if you're not bringing out the best in your leaders, ask yourself the question, what are you doing today to do this, to bring out the best in your leaders? And in a world where more firms and more companies are paying attention to this topic, ask yourself, and this brings us back to Leadership Alpha, but ask yourself, is what we're doing enough to gain an edge? And if your answer is, yeah, I think we've figured out how to develop and raise up great leaders, and that is going to give us an edge, go forth and prosper. If your answer is anything less than an emphatic yes, we're working on creating a program that's aimed at helping firms and their companies to unlock higher levels of people power performance by developing these leaders. There's a lot we can share on what that looks like, but we have something that is custom built for that gap. Yeah. Exciting times ahead, I think, both for that value proposition and also just maybe for the industry at large, at kind of stepping into this new realm of value creation and people power performance becoming maybe the name of the game in a few years. And we'll have to come back to this episode and see where Dan officially called his shot for the world that we're living in. So Dan, we're coming up on time here. So I do want to get a couple of rapid fire questions in, maybe to have a little fun with you. If you're still open for a couple of minutes here. Yeah.
Okay. So the first one's actually slightly, and then I don't want to say serious, maybe we'll call it sentimental. What's the first leadership moment you can remember in your career?
Can I go pre-career?
Yeah, absolutely.
We
don't have many stringent rules here on the podcast.
Yeah. Permission granted. I was named the head altar boy when I went to Catholic grade school. I was named the head altar boy at the grade school. There was like 20 or 30 altar boys. And the takeaway there, and I think it was because I was, I don't know, maybe the most responsible or among the more responsible. I would show up on time. I don't think it was because of any standout leadership qualities necessarily. But what I learned from that experience, and this has stuck with me, my perception of what leadership meant in that context at that time was just leading by example. I felt, and I can feel it right now as I'm talking about it, I felt a sense of accountability, even though it was a fairly arguably low stakes game. Like if you didn't trip with a candle in your hand, you're probably doing okay as an altar boy.
Yeah.
So fairly low stakes game from that standpoint, but I remember feeling a sense of accountability as a leader that I need to lead by example. I need to model the things. I didn't have this language back then, but I need to model the things that the parish expects of me. It's that same sense of accountability I felt in every leadership role I've had.
Yeah.
Which is there's gravity and importance to the calling of being a leader, and I felt it in a very early, crude way back then.
And I'll just double down, even though you glossed over it, saying it wasn't, maybe all that important to you at the time, but I would contend that great leaders are people who do just show up, even at times when it feels like they don't want to. So it sounds like you were doing that at a young age, and I've definitely experienced that from you in many, many working situations since.
Thanks.
All right. Second one, maybe a little bit lighter. So thanks for diving in the sentimental space with me. Favorite book or podcast other than Navigating Now that you are consuming right now?
There's a book called Winning Moves that was written by this really good looking guy with a slightly receding hairline. Hopefully
Dan wrote that book for folks listening, and Dan wrote that book.
Yeah, here's a little $9.99 at your local Amazon bookshelf. In seriousness, the podcast I listen to the most is, I listen to this every morning. They put out a new episode, which is 3 times a week, is one called My First Million. You ever heard of that one?
Yeah, it's a really good one.
It's kind of a goofy name, and they joke about this in the podcast. The name sounds sort of cheesy, but the podcast is on entrepreneurship. And what that podcast does for me is it sparks it. First of all, it's just interesting. They talk about a lot of very interesting hot topics in entrepreneurship, tactics for being an entrepreneur, a lot of case studies of interesting businesses and ideas. So it's intellectually stimulating. It also just every time I listen to it, it awakens in me this latent pent up entrepreneurial energy that I've always had, but at certain stops in my career, there hasn't been an outlet for. So inevitably, when I get home from the gym in the morning after having listened to one of these episodes, first place I stop is in front of my computer, jotting down ideas in my little Airtable, business backlog.
Oh, I love that.
So it's just I don't know. It's energizing to me.
Yeah. As someone who dove maybe a little bit later in their career into the entrepreneurial space, I couldn't agree more. Like drafting off the even like this, just the stories and the power of folks who have taken that leap to do their own thing it can be so energy giving, on any given day.
Yeah, totally.
All right, I got another one for you, Dan. This is a really, really important one. Actually, maybe this one might be sourced from the listeners. So what is more essential to the Dan Cremons look? Is it the Patagonia vest or is it the quarter zip sweater?
Quarter zip sweater, baby. Quarter zip sweater.
I didn't think that was going to be as easy as you made it out to be, because I know, Dan in a vest gets stuff done. But
well, I've graduated from the Patagonia. I don't know if it's graduated or downgraded from the Patagonia vest, but so I lived in San Francisco for a while when I worked in finance. And if you walk around down in the financial district in San Francisco, you can easily spot the private equity guys and gals, for that matter, with Patagonia vest. And I've always been one of for points in my life, I bought the Patagonia vest and sort of hid behind it, thinking that, I was playing. It's imposter syndrome at its core, but I'm playing the part, and nobody's going to know that I have no idea what I'm doing if I just lace up a Patagonia vest. But as I've gotten a little older, I've become a bit more counterculture, and I'm more attracted to weirdos nowadays and those that don't just conform. And so I've expanded my vest repertoire beyond Patagonia so as to cut against the grain.
There you go. As a fellow contrarian, I very much love that. Maybe I'll share this with you. I heard this said one time, and I thought it was hilarious. There's the farmer's tan, and then there's the financer's tan. So if you want to take that with you, you definitely can. What is the financer's tan? Oh, the financer's tan is you have it right around the shoulders because you're always wearing the vest, even when you go to sleep and even when you're, hanging around the house.
Gotta let the guns breathe.
You have to every now and then. All right, last one for you, Dan, and then we'll get you out of here. This one's a little bit more forward-looking. So, we just finished up, the calendar quarter, 9 more months of this year. What's one thing you're really excited to learn in the next 9 months?
This, off the top of my head, lots of things. Off the top of my head, the one that jumps to mind, this is maybe a little cliche, AI. I'm not a technologist by trade. And I feel like this is one of those, there are like moments in time. 99 to 2000 was one. The advent of mobile in the early 2010s was one. It's another moment in time where I think a lot of opportunity is going to be created and a lot of risk can be created to those that aren't on the front edge of that opportunity, driven by AI. And so I was thinking about this morning. Part of me wants to, and I'm nearly committed to locking myself in a cabin for a month and going deep on this topic and hiring coaches and those that know this who can teach me what I need to know to develop a point of view and figure out where the opportunity is in this. All within within the area that I focus most, which is value creation and human capital in PE-backed businesses. But I feel like we're sort of in the midst of something very big and important. And I personally am at risk of being left behind. So that's, I plan to dig into that quite a bit more in the next 12 months.
I love to hear that. And I guess if all of my emails and phone calls go unreceived,
you'll know why.
Maybe I'll know why.
Yeah.
Well, Dan, thanks again for coming on. Really, really fun conversation. I know we talked about a lot, your personal experience, what you're doing now, a concept of Leadership Alpha, energizing just to hear, I don't know, just everything you're thinking about doing and some of the partnership we're creating. So thanks again for jumping on. I'm sure this won't be the last time you and I are doing something like this. And here's to the next time.
Thanks for having me, man. And thanks for the work that you're doing in the world. Clearly, as we've talked about in this conversation, it's important stuff.
Appreciate that. All right. Till next time, buddy.
All right. We'll see you.
All right. And that'll do it for episode 179 of Navigating Now. Again, reminder, you can find us every week on Thursdays at 3 p.m. Central, 4 p.m. Eastern for our episodes. Our next episode coming up next week on next Thursday is episode 180. So join us there, and we'll have another great, riveting conversation for you with an amazing guest. So until then, stay safe, stay engaged, and we'll see you soon.